All right, hello and welcome to our review of track 1.5 for the groups that started halfway through track 1. So this will review dependent clauses and the types of dependent clauses. Let's get started. So let's start by reminding ourselves what a clause is, right? It's a segment of a sentence that has a subject, a predicate, and includes all the modifiers that go along with those things. And we have two main types of clauses, right? The first is an independent clause. So, an independent clause is a clause that expresses a complete thought, right? It's a simple sentence that can stand on its own. So, for example, without an umbrella, she got soaked in the rain. Now we have the subject, she. We have the predicate, got soaked. And then we have the additional modifiers, without an umbrella, prepositional phrase, and in the rain. So this is all part of one independent clause. Now dependent clauses are, let me change my laser pointer, are a clause that cannot stand on its own as a complete thought. It still has a subject and a predicate, but it just can't be by itself. Let's look at some examples. If the rain subsides, now that doesn't make sense on its own. It has a subject, rain, has a predicate, subsides, but it's not a complete thought. We need an independent subject, independent clause to make it a complete thought. So if the rain subsides, we will go outside. Adding that independent clause, we will go outside, makes it now a complete sentence. But this dependent clause cannot stand on its own. Now, things to keep in mind. The first is that dependent clauses start with subordinating conjunctions or relative pronouns. So that's a good way to tip off that you have a dependent clause there. Here are subordinating conjunctions, those wasabi words, but there's really like 50 of them, so wasabi doesn't do justice to all the subordinating conjunctions. And then here you have your relative pronouns. These are much easier to keep track of because there are way fewer of them than there are of subordinating conjunctions. But these are the guys that are going to start your dependent clauses. Another trick to keep in mind is that relative pronouns can be the subjects of dependent clauses. And that can be tricky. So if we look at the example, the man who complained was ignored, who is our relative pronoun? It's actually acting as the subject of this clause. Who complained? Who is the one who is complaining? That can get kind of tricky. All right, here are some examples of sentences with dependent clauses. Once the storm calmed down, the students cautiously went outside. So, the first thing I'm going to do here is see if I can identify subjects and predicates. So I have the storm calming. I have the students, I have the students cautiously. So there are my subjects and my predicates. So let's take a look now at the clauses. This comma gives me a hint that that's going to be a break in a clause. So this will be one. Here's a subordinating conjunction here. Once the storm calmed down. Not only do I have a subordinating conjunction, but once the storm calmed down is not a complete thought. So I know that this is a dependent clause. Let's look at the next one. The students cautiously went outside. That can stand on its own. That's an independent clause. Let's look at the next one. What Tabitha really wanted her mother to know was that her love was pure. Okay, now this one is kind of tricky because we actually have a clause acting as the subject of the sentence. So we have a dependent clause within an independent clause. So here's the predicate with this whole thing being the subject. But within this, I know that this is a dependent clause because we have Tabitha as the subject and wanted as the predicate. And what Tabitha really wanted her mother to know cannot stand as its own, on its own as a sentence. All right, let's keep going. That devilish woman who wore the pink hat continued to stare without pausing. Now, we have the woman is continuing. And so if we we can tell that this is a dependent clause because we have who as the subject and war as the predicate. So that devilish woman continued to stare without pausing works as an independent clause. This one is going to be a dependent clause. Okay. At this point, what I want you to do is to type out the dependent clauses in Edpuzzle, just the dependent clauses. All of these sentences are from Emma. And yeah, go ahead and pick them out. Just type them out, and I'll pause this now. Okay, good, you're back. Now let's go over these sentences. She was considered with all the regard and respect which a harmless old lady under such circumstances can excite. So I already see a relative pronoun here, which. So I'm going to take a look at that and see if it might be a dependent clause. Which a harmless old lady under such circumstances can excite. We have old lady as the subject and can excite as the predicate. So, which a harmless old lady under such circumstances can excite. That is a dependent clause because that cannot stand on its own. Let's look at the next one. As she sat one morning looking forward to exactly such a close of the present day, a note was brought from Mrs. Goddard. All right, we have as a subordinating conjunction here, which I am going to put a box around. She is the subject, sat as the predicate. As she sat one morning, that can't stand on its own, but let's keep going. As she sat one morning looking forward to exactly such a close of the present day. Oh, this is also part of the clause because looking is describing what she's doing. So we have to make sure we include that. But notice this whole part with looking forward is not its own clause because it doesn't have a subject. A note was brought from Mrs. Goddard stands on its own, so we know that's independent. Let's look at the next one. Miss Smith was a girl of 17 whom Emma knew very well by sight and had long felt an interest in on account of her beauty. So let's take a look. I see a relative pronoun whom. I have Emma as a subject, knew as a predicate, whom Emma knew very well by sight and had long felt an interest in on account of her beauty. That all belongs together. So this is a very long dependent clause. It cannot stand on its own. But we have, so actually, had is another part of this predicate for Emma. If we look at the independent clause, Miss Smith was a girl of 17. That can be fine on its own. You get to be careful to include all of the modifiers and all of the parts that belong to a clause. All right, next. He loved to have the tablecloth laid because it had been the fashion of his youth. But his conviction of suppers being very unwholesome made him rather sorry to see anything put on the table. Okay, so we have subordinating conjunction because it is the subject, had been as the predicate. Let's see what belongs to it. Because it had been the fashion of his youth. Oh, that's going to be the dependent clause. Let's look at what we have left over. He loved to have the tablecloth laid, but his conviction of suppers being very unwholesome made him rather sorry to see anything put upon the table. Yeah, so this is just two independent clauses combined. So this would actually be a compound complex sentence because we have more than one independent clause and at least one dependent clause. One thing that you should not get tricked by with dependent clauses are prepositions. Upon, I'm going to do them in a different color. Upon is a preposition, right? With is a preposition. To is a preposition, or it's going to start an infinitive phrase. So these are the things that do not start dependent clauses. All right. But now let's get into kinds of dependent clauses. We have three. We have adjective, adverb, and noun, right? So there's two kinds of clauses, independent and dependent, three kinds of dependent clauses, adjective, adverb, and noun. So let's start with adjective clauses. These are clauses that act as, you guessed it, adjectives. They describe nouns and or pronouns. They start with relative pronouns. And remember, these relative pronouns can act as subjects. So here are some of our buddies, the relative pronouns. This is a checklist you can follow to make sure it's an adjective clause. So first, is it a dependent clause, right? So does it have a subject and a verb, and can it not stand on its own, right? 2, does it start with a relative pronoun? 3, does it describe a noun or pronoun? Those are all, good things to look at when you're trying to decide if something is an adjective clause. Let's take a look at some examples. She had no scruples which could stand many minutes against the earnest pressing of both the others. So we have the relative pronoun here, and that's acting as the subject. Could stand is acting as the predicate, which could stand many minutes against the earnest pressing of both the others. So we know that at least up till many minutes, it's the clause. Against is actually describing how it could stand. And that means it belongs as part of this clause here. All right. She had no scruples stands fine on its own. So this is our adjective clause. It's describing scruples, which makes it an adjective. Check. Okay. There he had not always the patience that could have been wished. That here is the subject. Could have been wished is all the predicate. But let's make sure it's an adjective now. Oh, it's describing patience. That makes it an adjective. I really never could think well of anybody who proposed such a thing to anybody else. We got our relative pronoun who. Let's make sure it's a dependent clause. We got that as the subject. This is the predicate. Who proposed such a thing to anybody else cannot stand on its own. And it is describing anybody, which makes it an adjective. They were just approaching the house where lived Mrs. and Miss Bates. Now this is tricky because where can act as the start of a noun. Actually, all of these can act as the start of a noun clause. And where can also be the start of an adverb clause. So where can be tricky. But it is a relative pronoun. Sometimes. It's acting as the subject here. Lived is the predicate. Where lived Mrs. and Miss Bates, that's not a complete thought. So that can be a dependent clause. Is it describing anything? Yes, it's describing the house. That makes it an adjective. It's describing a noun. All right, forward. Now it is your turn. You are going to type the adjective clauses in each sentence. All right, ready? Let's get started. Her father never went beyond the shrubbery where 2 divisions of the ground sufficed him for his long walk. Relative pronoun where. We have a subject, 2 divisions, or just divisions. Sufficed is the predicate. So where 2 divisions of the ground sufficed him for his long walk, all of these belong together. They're all modifiers. That's describing the shrubbery. That's an adjective clause. She was a happy woman, and a woman whom no one named without good will. We got our relative pronoun whom, subject no one, predicate named, without good will belongs to it. It's describing woman. Next, she was a very pretty girl, and her beauty happened to be of a sort which Emma particularly admired. Which is the relative pronoun. Emma is the subject. Admired is the predicate. This whole thing is describing sort. It's an adjective clause. She thought herself a most fortunate creature, surrounded with blessings and so many good neighbors and friends, and a home that wanted for nothing. Relative pronoun. It's acting as the subject. Wanted is the predicate. For nothing is describing wanted. And this whole thing is describing home, making this, you guessed it, an adjective clause. Let's keep going. Now we got our adverb clause.